Spikes and you know the gilding and everything else, very ornate. But when soldiers took to the field on campaign, on patrol, and just doing like in this case, most likely these soldiers are fanning out to cover this supply train or wagon train here. Dusty, dirty work, and a lot of these guys that did it were infantry. And at the core of the military experience was the infantry. And I'm not going to talk as much about cavalry equipment today because it was the cavalry stuff was its own kind of thing, which they did use a lot of the same items. But of course they varied some things because they had specialized jobs to do. And so, but I'm going to focus on the infantry because that was the core of kind of the military gear. And those guys did a lot of the kind of the workhorse dirty work that doesn't get a lot of recognition a lot of times. Now, of course, one of our first images that we can think of, I jumped to a cavalry image, but you know, you can't go wrong when you're talking about you know, the likes of Remington and Russell, you know, doing with their images of soldiers in the West. And it's certainly a good place to get some idea of what it was like soldiering out there. And it's a harsh climate. In a lot of cases, the uniforms, even though the colors are fairly muted, you know, you're out and about in the dirt and the dust and the heat. You can only imagine how hot it was on the day that's being portrayed here. Probably triple digits. Good chance of it. You know, even though the guys are wearing how many layers of clothing, including their wool jackets. But that's, you know, this is part of the way we get the idea of what soldiers look like during that period. And of course, again, here's a Remington painting. Some soldiers out in the field, buffalo soldiers in this case, on horseback. And, you know, and it's interesting, I mean, very vivid colors in this one. And it's probably, they must have just had their uniforms clean because they wouldn't, you know, after you're on campaign or any time out in the field, modern soldiers, all soldiers across the sphere of American experience know that your uniform is not going to be the same color in a very short period of time. So, now of course a lot of the images that we grew up with and that we associate with are from movies. I mean, there's it's not an accident that that's the case. And movies are fine, and you know, the big part about watching movies is, do you like the movie or not? So that's the base level of the experience. But you know how it is, any time you get into a field of collecting of things that you particularly enjoy, you start to kind of find things that aren't quite right. Whether it's a movie or whether it's, you know, various depictions, even of course museums fall into this at times, where, you know, we try to get things right, but maybe not always quite exactly right. But, you know, in this case, you know, the uniforms are probably a little bit too clean generally, but that's, you know, that's not a real big deal. You know, and one of the other things that's interesting is a lot of the actors that are portraying the soldiers here, generally, you know, probably a lot of them are a little bit too old for the actual soldiers that went on campaign. The fact is, I mean, now you certainly have older officers and a lot of older veteran soldiers, but the majority of the soldiers were wet behind the ears kids. These were very young men who, you know, going, you know, whatever reason they had joined the Army, they were usually quite young. And so that's one thing that movies don't always get exactly right. Now, of course, you're in the West for even a short period of time, and people age quite rapidly. People often did tend to look older than they actually were because it was a harsh environment. But, you know, one of the things that they get right in this is a lot of the guys, they don't have their headgear. They might lose it during campaign. The headgear would vary, although probably most of the soldiers would be having some kind of, the hats like this, the kind of the campaign hats, slouch hats, something that would cover and protect better. And one thing, and I don't want to nitpick too much, but one of the interesting things that you inevitably see in a lot of old movies, and even certainly in some new ones, you look at these soldiers, and many of them are in their shirts. And they also have their ranks on their shirts. Well, in the 19th century Army, that was a no-no. If you're wearing your undershirt, you did not have your rank on your sleeve. You also did not have your rank on your shoulder. Your shirts wouldn't display your rank. You would have to be wearing a jacket like Mr. Fonda is here to actually be showing sleeve stripes. The way you would go by, what you would go by was to tell who was what rank was generally going to be that. Oh, looks like the batteries are running thin on that. Well, you can see the stripes on the trousers. That's how you would go by the rank a lot of times, and there were other markers as well that would help identify that. But so when you're watching movies, certain things take with a grain of salt. Always kind of think about them in that way. And again, the bottom line is, if you enjoy the movie, it doesn't really matter. As long as you maybe sometimes you have to bite your lip a little bit, but that's all right. And again, we look at popular depictions over time, and a lot of the soldiers in the movie over there with John Wayne, same thing. They're wearing their shirts, but again, that type of thing wouldn't be sanctioned by regulation until the turn of the century. It was when the Army was operating in the tropics in the Philippines that when soldiers were more commonly wearing their shirts, because even in the late 19th century, here in Arizona, soldiers would commonly wear their 5-button coats like that. And so even out on campaign when the weather was unpleasant, now that wouldn't always last real long because things would start to tear, and the uniforms might even shred a little bit, and they might discard them because for any number of reasons. But it wasn't until the turn of the century that the soldiers would more commonly wear just their shirts instead of wearing their jackets. At that point, they start putting the insignia on the sleeves. And then after that, they start to shrink the insignia because we're in an era of using smokeless powder and where camouflage is more important. And so if your rank is a bright yellow spot on your blue shirt when you're trying to hide somewhere, that's not going to work real well. So slowly things change, and then we see some depictions in Hollywood again changing. Like Danny Glover up there as a Buffalo Soldier, he's actually got his carbine sling, which in the first depiction with Henry Fonda, the cavalry troopers didn't have their carbine slings, and that's something that was the cavalryman's. Instead of having a shoulder strap for your rifle, they had the carbine sling to carry their short rifles. And that was something that those guys carried with them all the time, because they would always either have that carbine at their side or on horseback with that big leather sling across them. And so you start to see that more often. There's the movie Geronimo down below there, and I think Philip Langelier was a technical assistant to that. So you get a lot more authenticity in terms of setting and in uniforms and things like that as time goes on. And there we go. And then, of course, the thing we always want to refer back to a lot of times are the people that were there. Remington was, a guy who was out west with these guys, traveling around with them as a correspondent, and so he was there firsthand. And the thing is, the problem a lot of times in the late 1800s was photography had not really caught up that much to the point. It's why a lot of times we end up with more photos of the ornate uniforms, because the fact of the matter is that it's a lot easier to take those photos in a nice studio. And of course, if you're in a nice studio, you're probably not going to wear your uniform that you just spent 6 months in. You're going to put on your nice stuff and send so you can send a photo to your family back home. So, but it was these correspondents in a lot of ways to give us snapshots of these soldiers. And so here we actually look at some early depictions of soldiers on the frontier. And this is just right after the Civil War. Now this guy right here on the far side he is actually more in a Civil War dress, and that's actually some of the type of uniform that the soldiers that came out west immediately after the war would have been wearing. Again, imagine the guys coming in to establish Fort McDowell in 1865 or 1866 era, wearing those uniforms, carrying their muzzle loaders and their 40 rounds of ammunition in their cartridge boxes. During summer that would not be pleasant. But it was still stringent. It was Victorian era. All of you know, looking at old photographs, that regardless of the weather, people tended to dress. They tended to dress up. They tended to dress more thoroughly. You didn't see T-shirts and shorts, things like that. So now we have the soldier on the right, just a few years later, and he's got a breech-loading firearm now. The technology, the Civil War really helped catapult that forward, where you're no longer loading your standard infantryman isn't loading his rifle through the muzzle anymore. Now he's loading it through the back of the rifle, which means his rate of fire is increased greatly, at least 3, 4, maybe 5 times. So they're putting out a lot more firepower in terms of when they're in combat and situations like that. But of course, a lot of the uniform looks very much the same, and it's still a single-shot rifle. Well, a lot of times when we think about the old military of this period, we think of things like the top rifle, the old Spencer carbine or a rifle, or as we're getting into that post-Civil War period, well, we had the Henry during the Civil War, and then we have the Model 1866 Winchester and the other models after that. Well, it's kind of funny. At times we look back and say, well, why didn't the Army just adopt something like that? You have more firepower. You're not just having soldiers with single-shot firearms. Well, a big part of the problem with these early repeating firearms is the fact that, when I say repeating firearms, that you have a magazine, that you have multiple shots before you have to reload. Unlike and we'll see more of those kind of what collectors often refer to as the trapdoor rifles, where you load one shot at a time. The problem with these was the pistol rounds, or the cartridges that they fired were not as powerful as what the Army wanted. The Army wanted what they would call man stoppers, cartridges that were generally, the length of which was going to be substantial. And we're talking Civil War cartridges for rifles were 58 caliber. Post-Civil War rifles were 50 caliber. Then it went to 45 caliber. So these are big. These are big, and these early repeating firearms couldn't handle those type of things. They really didn't. That technology didn't really advance until into the 1880s, when I think Mr. Browning joined the Winchester Company, and some other companies made some advances like that. But single-shot rifles actually kind of rule the day. So again, in a lot of those movies that we see where, say, cavalrymen are using Winchesters, well, there would be some exceptions where that did occasionally happen, but most of the time it did not. They were using single-shot weapons. Now, some of this technology actually even went overseas. This is a Winchester loading type technology in a Swiss rifle. The Swiss were actually one of the first countries to adopt a repeating firearm that I think had 12 or 15 rounds that they could fire. Again, not real high power rounds, but then again, the Swiss wanted to have a weapon that had a little extra deterrent against some of their noisier neighbors. Especially when you're neighbors to Germany and France and some of these other countries, the Swiss made sure that they were well armed. So now, of course, a lot of times people think, well, what, even something like for the little Bighorn in 1876, when Custer and the cavalrymen with him were wiped out, they think, well, why didn't they carry Gatling guns with them? Well, a big part of the reason is cavalry is much more mobile. And they don't want to be dragging an artillery piece around with them, which at this time, Gatling guns still were really artillery pieces. They were basically, they were often run by, say, like these soldiers who were probably infantrymen, but they were treated basically as artillery. And they were pretty cumbersome. Theoretically, they would work well, but most commanders left them behind and would use them. They would practice with them on occasion. They did have some military uses at times, but there was a big problem with these early firearms, or with early machine guns. We get some idea from this image of Mobile Bay during the Civil War. Well, you notice all the tremendous amount of smoke. And of course, the artist has actually peeled back some of the layers of smoke from the reality would have been probably they would be like these guys were traveling in a fog. But you do get some sense of that. And we look at a reenactment from about the turn of the century of the Civil War, and you look at the amount of smoke going up from that. So black powder firearms burn real dirty. They put out a lot of smoke, fog of war, that type of thing. When smokeless powder comes along, things start to change. It's even, we'll get into it in a little bit, but why uniforms stayed blue for so long. When you were firing black powder, basically as soon as you fired, you gave your position away. So camouflage wasn't quite as important in those days. It wouldn't be until we come to smokeless powder, which is basically modern gunpowder, that burns clean, and then you don't see a puff of smoke coming up. Of course, Hollywood didn't always like that, so there was, either, depending on some older movies, there were no puffs of smoke, or there were too many puffs of smoke. So it goes both ways. And so these were some of the early firearms that were used. This up top is a Remington, known as a rolling block, a single-shot rifle. Down below is the earliest Army breech-loading design, and for issued infantry troops right after the Civil War. And most hunters, even in the early years, or up into the 1880s, until the more high-caliber repeating weapons were available, they generally preferred these powerful single-shot firearms. It's like a lot of people are familiar with the Sharps, real powerful Sharps rifle, and for anybody, if you've seen the movie Quigley Down Under, I know there have been some other movie depictions, but real powerful long cartridges. A lot of hunters preferred those type of things, even over the Winchesters and things like that, which had the range essentially of a pistol round a lot of times. So, and not quite as much power. So now the Army, as it begins adopting these more successful breech-loading designs, this is a 50 caliber rifle. In fact, what's interesting, Buffalo Bill had this greatest success and earned the name Buffalo Bill using one of these Army 50-70 caliber rifles. And a 50 caliber, 70 grains of black powder. And he was, riding, using one of these long, tall rifles, riding on horseback, shooting buffalo. Not the easiest thing to do. So, but he liked his rifle so much he called it Lucretia Borgia. So, obviously he had some affection for that old rifle. And oh yes.
How heavy were these rifles?
Oh, I don't know.
30 pounds.
They were heavy, but
20 pounds.
It's funny because even modern rifles are often a similar heft, at least the M16s, things like that. It's just where the weight's concentrated. I want to say I'm going to say 10 or 12 pounds, but that's ballparking it right now.
The iron mechanisms, though, were they pretty heavy?
The mechanisms weren't overly heavy. The weight was kind of distributed a lot through the weapon. Whereas, say, in an M16, even if the weight's about the same, a lot of the weight is concentrated more, say, towards the rear of it. So the mechanisms actually weren't overly heavy in these. The stock and the furniture, I think, added to some of the heft because they use that real strong, good quality woods.
Cavalry was shorter than that.
Well, that's right. That's right. It was a shorter firearm for the cavalry, so definitely a lighter weapon too. No, it's a good question as to exactly what the heft of those was. It seemed to work, and the Army was always concerned about weight and trying to keep the weight of those firearms down. And what's interesting is you look at some of these early breech loaders, and this is the firing pin mechanism in these old trapdoors. And in the early period of time, a lot of people referred to these American breech loaders as needle guns. A lot of times today, needle guns often refer to old German military firearms of an earlier period. But today, collectors often refer to these as trap doors because the breech mechanism literally flips up like a trap door, but because it's got this hinge right here. But back then, the big deal to folks was that long firing pin, that needle. So these were needle guns, and it's just interesting at times how some of the parlance changes about these different things over time. And here, just a lot of times you get the sense of what it took to move an army back in those days. You know, again, you watch a lot of movies, and, you know, the wagon train is, you know, a half dozen or a dozen wagons. Well, that's, you know, the reality was often more like this. You know, especially when you were supplying big columns. I just read in a source recently that a regiment of 1,000 men required about, 5 or 6 wagons pulled by, each pulled by 6 mules, and that was just for about 3 days out in the field. Well, if you were out longer in the field, you were going to need a lot more wagons. And so a lot of these campaigns back in these years moved slowly because they had to keep their supplies with them. And so, again, it's a little bit counter to what we envision it, because a lot of times in movies, it's just, you know, a dozen, 2 dozen guys on horseback running out, you know, for weeks at a time by themselves out in the middle of nowhere, and still, you know, dressed to the nines after you know, a few weeks. Well, of course, the reality is a little bit different. They had to take everything with them, and they often moved slow. That's why it was important to have the cavalry that could probe ahead and do reconnaissance and things like that, as well as to fight an enemy when it came to a lot of the plains tribes that were very mobile. So these big slow columns, it was a slow convergence. Basically, they were converging on the Indian villages because they, you know, not just to fight battles per se, but to push villages out. And so here again, views of soldiers in the field. You see their carbine slings here. You see the cartridge belts they're wearing, some of the equipment. And again, these are wonderful ways to get an idea of what soldiers looked like back then. More here from Remington. We have some of the buffalo soldiers around a campfire. And it's always a good thing. It's you know, another thing that my grandfather always pushed was, you know, with his love of photography, is there's a lot you can discover in photography and be a detective and see not only what people wore, but things that they would wear that you don't necessarily expect to see. And so again, it's nice to get these snapshots from Remington, these drawings, which, you know, years ago I used to think that a lot of these old drawings were not that accurate. Well, they're actually quite well done. They're quite amazing. And then we actually, on some rare occasions, we get actual photographs of soldiers doing their business out in the field. And here we have soldiers heading towards Wounded Knee in the 1890s. These are infantrymen. Pretty rare to see infantry out in the field at this time. Kind of, you know, again, now the camera technology is starting to get to the point where it can capture people in motion. But you also have to have photographers willing to go out to dangerous places. Now, if you go to dangerous places with a lot of heavily armed men, you're probably feeling a little bit better about it, taking a few more photographs. But the photographer's still braving things, certainly. This is cold here, and these guys are bundled up. So we start to see more depictions of these soldiers actually out in the you know, real world environments. Here's some of the buffalo soldiers that were up at the Wounded Knee wearing a lot of their gear for cold weather. As cold as it was up there, even these buffalo fur jackets, things like that were finally standard Army issued by this period. But now, during Wounded Knee period, the Army was actually getting fairly uniform. In this period, 1870s, going into the 1880s, this is about how uniform a lot of soldiers often were. It looks like a rabble here, and a lot of it's just mixed different types of uniforms, mixed different models of hats, and occasionally some personal preferences. I can guarantee that shirt's not standard issue. You know, things like that. Guys would often dress for comfort. And this photo was probably taken, I think, I believe it's at Camp Grant or one of the posts here in Arizona in the 1870s. And another depiction of soldiers at that time, this is some of the troops with General Crook's branch of the campaign during the Little Bighorn campaigns. And you want to talk about, would you mistake these guys for soldiers? These guys are a mess. And this was actually part of what was referred to as the starvation march, when they were starting to run out of food. And they're actually starting, they have to start butchering their horses and mules. So, an extra hard campaign, but certainly is giving you an idea of what the soldier in the field looked like. And again, there's more soldiers during that same period. Here's a guy actually that stood for a studio portrait after being on campaign, which is quite rare. And that's not that Hollywood guy. But that guy is a little more close to the reality. And I'm going to do a couple things to kind of power through this quick, because as you can tell, I tend to talk a little bit. But I want to give you from a guy who was at the Little Bighorn. This is a soldier named William H. White, who was with the 2nd Cavalry, some of the guys that came upon the site and found Custer's troops after they had been decimated. And he said, when we had first seen the Reno soldiers on the distant hilltop, this is Major Reno's command that was a little had defended themselves against attacks when Custer's troops were killed. Let's see, when we'd first seen the Reno soldiers on the distant hilltop that morning, we had thought they were Indians we had seen the evening before, as we were about to camp at the present Crow Agency site. Whatever they may have thought when they saw us, it seems they readily could have mistaken us for a horde of bandits. We had then but little of the appearance of the United States soldiers, especially as to clothing. Only a stray one of us here or there had left on his body any resemblance to regularity in Army uniform. We had been out from Fort Ellis almost 3 months, and no replacement clothing was available. When any article of habiliment had been lost or damaged, it stayed lost or became more damaged, with no opportunity to get a new article of the same kind, and often no opportunity to get any sort of substitute. So overalls and checkered hickory shirts, these purchased from traders on boats along the Yellowstone River, were being worn by many of us by the time we got to the Little Bighorn, even those who had become ragged and much soiled, even those that had become ragged and much soiled. Army hats or caps had been lost, and rags or other head coverings were in use, or men were going bareheaded. Boots that were worn out had been replaced by self-made moccasins of buffalo or other skin. Uncut hair and shaggy beards were in universal vogue. Among the irregularly clad soldiers in our given outfit was Lieutenant Johnny McAdams of Troop H. He was our only man wearing a full suit of buckskin. It was all right except in rainy weather. I recollect well the jokings from his fellow officers when his raiment got soaked through during the rainy night when we were struggling through pitch darkness over rugged hills in order to get to the mouth of the Little Bighorn, but he could not remedy the matter for he had no other clothing. So you really get a sense of, again, the Hollywood depictions are just, in a lot of ways at times, nowhere near the reality. And again, it comes down to do you like the movie or not. But and a lot of times, would folks who've come out to see the various stars looking as bedraggled as this soldier has described? It might not sell as many tickets at the box office. So and again, but we take from a lot of these old images, exactly what it looked like to soldier in the field. And here we actually see a soldier at the turn of the century, probably even serving over in the Philippines, is pinned very crudely, some stripes on his shirt. Here we have an old sergeant of probably the 10th or the 9th Cavalry, has his standard uniform on with his stripes. So things are changing, they're allowing the soldiers to take their Victorian norms are relaxing a little bit. And so soldiers are able to finally start wearing more relaxed clothing, whereas in the field, of course, reality would dictate that when your uniform fell apart, you were wearing more relaxed clothing. So, and of course, things get a little more uniform by the 1880s in particular. You can see these officers and some of their scouts out on a hunt, probably out actually near this area from Camp Verde. And then we have General Crook up here, a man who always dressed for comfort when he was out in the field, wearing a sun helmet, wearing a kind of a brown kind of a denim jacket, and a shotgun, and he would ride a mule. So this is not kind of a sexy Hollywood depiction here, but these were guys that were actually out doing the hard work. And just to give an idea, I mentioned before about the different types of ammunition. Well, this is back in the old days when the cartridge boxes were these heavy-duty Civil War cartridge boxes. And this one that I brought up here is actually a post-Civil War box. This one dates to around 1872. And it looks a lot like that one, but it's kind of scaled down. And it's got loops in it actually to hold the metallic ammunition. Well, these Civil War boxes were in part really bulky because they had to have tins inside them to protect this delicate ammunition that was wrapped in paper or in different kinds of skin. So that was the old muzzle loaders. Over time, they switched the metallic cartridges for the breech loading rifles, and the Army has millions of these cartridge boxes left over from the war, and a frugal War Department, well, more frugal Congress, says we're not going to pay for anything new. So the Army has to adapt, and so they stick. They take the tins out and they stick in sheepskin, or fleece rather. They put in wooden blocks drilled with holes, all kinds of things. They come out with these cartridge boxes like this one down here that have these loops in them, and those were more successful because each individual round got a loop. But it looked a lot like, when you think of a cartridge belt, that's what these boxes are starting to look like. Even a little bit later design from 1874 cartridge box that has loops in it looks like they chopped up a cartridge belt and stuck it into a box. The Army really loved cartridge boxes, or rather I should say the powers that be in the Army loved cartridge boxes because they looked neat. They looked a lot nicer than these cartridge belts. Well, soldiers weren't having it. And they made their own cartridge belt. Here somebody took an old Civil War era cartridge, or an old Civil War era belt, and sewed cartridge loops onto it. In the post-Civil War period, soldiers observed a lot of hunters doing that, and they began to do the same thing. Here you see a guy in a lot of his campaign uniform, although still very, probably before he went out into the field. But he's got his cartridge belt on that's been fabricated just like that one. Now, then the Army finally relents in the late 1870s, and they create this cartridge belt here. And it was the first effort by the Army to acknowledge, actually they were acknowledging that the soldiers, in particular in the West where they were actively on campaign, if they didn't have to wear it, they didn't. And so they would do whatever they wanted to. Well, one of the problems with these leather cartridge belts was it would build up this crust of verdigris, that green verdigris. You're all familiar, anytime if you've seen something that's leather that comes into contact with brass, you start to get some of that buildup at different times depending on how the brass is treated. And so that was a problem. In fact, it was a possible problem for some of Custer's troops that, as your carbine heated up during this battle, while you're panicking, now this verdigris is occasionally causing the shell to basically cement inside your carbine. So you can just imagine some of the panic that would be added to that whole situation by the addition of things like that. So these cartridge belts made out of cloth were the acceptable Army solution to that. So the Army arsenals in places back like Watervliet, New York, and later on Rock Island Arsenal started to fabricate belts like this. And the soldiers took to them right away. And because they were good, again, you didn't have to clean the cartridges off regularly because to avoid the verdigris and the dirt. So you had something that worked. Well, before too long, an officer named Anson Mills comes up with the Mills belt, which is a woven belt. This is basically the beginning of the American woven military belt and equipment, which, you know, there's still a form of woven kind of equipment in use today. It's just nylon, different materials like that. But it was back here in 1880 when this when equipment first started to be used. It was much more resilient than these types of kind of canvas belts, and so and also came with these dandy brass plates that very, you know, suited Victorian stylings. These cartridge belts, a lot of officers felt they looked a little bit too much like something a bandit would use. They were very not ornate, and in the Victorian era, non-ornate didn't sit well with a lot of military folks. So the soldiers begin to wear these quite a bit. You see whether they're infantry or whether they're cavalry. Sometimes they modify them. Believe it or not, during the 1880s, while General Sherman was still around, General Sherman made an order that said you're not allowed to hang any equipment off of your cartridge belt. Well, how's that going to work? Well, once General Sherman retires, they start hanging things off the cartridge belts, but little things like that kind of get in the way. The cavalry adopts its own version, so they don't have that big clunky H buckle on there. You can see a Buffalo soldier here with his carbine or his cartridge belt. And of course, there's a clunky old Army backpack, a common piece of equipment. And a lot of times, the soldiers, you know, even before the Civil War, but especially during and even long after, would put a lot of their necessary gear, extra clothing, socks, whatever, into blanket rolls and sling it over themselves. That was a common thing to see. Well, the Army didn't like that. That's kind of messy looking, and so they want them to wear things like these kind of harnesses, modeled a lot on the British system. Well, the soldiers, unless it was soldiers who were, say, back east somewhere, who basically were required to wear this stuff because they weren't on campaign, most soldiers in the West threw this stuff away, or they kept it back at the barracks. Here, a more evolved system comes along in about 1874. You can see the soldiers maybe not too terribly excited about wearing it. But, you know, the Army is still persisting that they want their soldiers to wear this kind of equipment. Well, some of the soldiers do like some of these articles of equipment, some of these bags. The haversack, like this haversack here that carries your mess kit, the old Army mess kit, which, scary enough, I don't know exactly what mess kits look like now, but when my dad was in, they still look a lot like this.
What year is that?
This is actually a model 1874 mess kit, probably manufactured in the 1880s, 1890s era, but they would be in use for a long time. In fact, they look the same even into World War I and after. So certainly these pieces of equipment were very popular and lasted a really long time. And it was about 1878 when not only that new cartridge belt design came about, but they came up with new ideas for the canteens. They used leather shoulder straps instead of cloth. The leather was more durable and wouldn't cut into their shoulders with a heavy canteen. They adopted this kind of backpack, which is called a blanket bag. This was a really popular backpack, actually, and it was something that you'll often see in photographs of soldiers. This is an early test of that blanket bag, and it literally has the blanket stuffed inside of it. And there's an early version of that made at that federal arsenal. And there's some of the soldiers. These guys are in heavy marching order. They've got all their equipment with them. A lot of times when soldiers were operating out in the field, they shed a lot of that stuff. Only carried what they had to. Would be in basically what would be referred to as light marching order. But when you were told to wear all that stuff and when you were told to move from one base to another, that's what you carried with you. And so here's a depiction of soldiers out in the field. Again, pretty rare to see views like this. And I'm not shy to say that I scanned, borrowed, stole a lot of photos to depict this type of thing. From there really are a lot of wonderful sources out there to find these photos, but it can take some work. And then there's Mr. Remington again depicting these soldiers in heavy marching order. A couple wearing the blankets here as well. So again, it's looking around, because a lot of times we wouldn't get a sense of exactly what these soldiers wore and what they carried. Even the Marines are carrying these blanket bags up into the 19-teens. So these are guys probably going off to Veracruz or somewhere in the Caribbean using that equipment. The Army used it up until the early 1900s. And even some of the military surplus catalogs, and this is, back in the day, would buy a lot of this old equipment. And again, their old catalogs are wonderful sources for everybody that's seen them, and for anybody that hasn't. Tremendous amount of information in here, and really excellent drawings. And also gives you an idea of how popular these were. For a lot of collectors and folks interested in things like this, it seems like these blanket bags are fairly scarce. Part of the problem was, as in the Bannerman catalog indicates, they said, and this is by their 1927 catalog, we have sold over 80,000 of these in the past 5 years. And they continued to have a large number on stock. They were popular backpacks. I mean, Boy Scouts were buying these. Campers, hikers, all sorts of folks. So a lot of them simply got used up, and for a lot of old Army equipment, if it wasn't something that was really tough and rigid, even like these old canteens, they just didn't stand up well over time, because they got reused and then eventually thrown away. So, and then there's our Bannerman catalog there. Bannerman, who operated out of New York State, went into the surplus business basically at the time of the Civil War and after, and had nothing short of an empire. This guy was he was like the surplus dealer. He was supplying armies, armies in South America and places like that. Even had a castle on the Hudson River where they stored a lot of stuff. A castle that at one point blew up because some of the munitions caught fire. But it's still there today, or what's left of it's still there. So, but these surplus dealers are the folks that helped a lot of this stuff come down through the years. I mean, quite honestly, some of the stuff that's on the table and the items over here were likely at Bannerman's shop at one time or another. That's how big they were. So them and a number of dealers around the country helped save a lot of these things. There were other systems that they tried, other backpacks that weren't necessarily the most popular. Another kind of something where they would actually tie a blanket over their shoulder and have an Army-sanctioned blanket roll, which did eventually replace these backpacks. And then the haversack that started out in the Civil War is kind of a tarred or painted coating of canvas, went to canvas, and in the post-Civil War period you have rubberized canvas, and then you have this more kind of standard kind of canvas finish. And the Army is getting more kind of a drab color, more things that are more robust and useful in the field and much more stronger. And the fact that they've survived to today tells us something. Because a lot of these things were heavily used. And then they had things like, this is a predecessor. The Army referred to mess kits as a meat can. And so that was the meat can adopted about 1872. And it's fun to look at, but it's rare because it didn't really work that well. It was shortly replaced by this. It was narrow. It was hard. The soldiers were told to use this thing as a cup. Can you imagine drinking out of a little rectangular trough? Not real popular, and they couldn't stick their meat ration in there too easy either. So pretty quickly they switch over to this. And of course, same thing, canteens slowly evolve over time. They go from the wool-covered Civil War canteens to starting to cover those same Civil War canteens with heavy-duty canvas and a little felt interior. Here it is. They add a cloth shoulder strap. It's a wider shoulder strap than the old Civil War straps. And here's that leather shoulder strap on the canteen to the right. And some of these canteens, eventually the modifications that they made to hold on the shoulder straps would fail, and then it gets the IC mark, this inspected and condemned, and thrown away. Somehow this one survived the scrap heap some way or other. And then occasionally the Army even acquiesced to soldiers, say in the Southwest, carrying 2 canteens. Imagine that. So not a bad idea if you're out in chasing Geronimo in 110-degree weather. So, and eventually, as weapons were getting more accurate, more dangerous, more long range, there's more of an acknowledgement that they need some sort of digging tool. Well, the Army really, in a lot of ways, made mostly half-hearted attempts in the late 19th century. Again, it wasn't a period of quite digging in that it would become by the turn of the century with the Philippines. Although we did see plenty of that during the Civil War, Petersburg, a lot of those trenches, things like that. But the soldiers had full-size shovels that they would be handed, or else they were hired laborers to dig that stuff. And then we have, I guess I didn't skip one. But eventually they did come up with a digging tool that was basically referred to as a hunting knife at first, but it had a wide blade. They eventually called it an entrenching knife. Probably most of them, eventually they were somewhat popular with the troops because they finally had some kind of a side knife. But basically, eventually probably most would be used by gardeners, quite honestly, because they work quite well for that. So, and you get the other items of equipment that you want to have as more soldiers are becoming literate. They're reading their manuals about their firearms, and in fact the Army will require literacy, I believe, by the 1890s, even by the turn of the century. The tools to fix your rifles, the tools to extract broken cartridges on the right in case the cartridge case splits or gets stuck in your weapon. These, incidentally, I think were created after the little bighorn. Did not much help for those guys. But again, just looking at photographs, getting a sense of what people really looked like and what they carried during that time period that really gives us the best idea of that. And then it's hard to find those photos because, again, most of the time you didn't depict yourself in the studio with all your field gear like this guy has. You were in your full dress uniform, the one that they normally made you dress up in and march around on the parade ground in hotter weather than you cared to think about while your officers barked orders at you. So this is a much more relaxed, the way the soldiers more commonly looked on a day-to-day basis. And eventually technologies are changing. The beginning of the mechanized army. Of course, the horse is still the key to mechanization at this time. But the Army is experimenting with bicycles, things like that. So we see those soldiers carrying their bulky gear on these bikes, and I think these are 24th Infantry soldiers, one of the Buffalo Soldier regiments, on a long ride from. This one was actually historically followed from one of the forts in Nebraska. They went. I want to say they went about 1,500 or 2,000 miles. So yeah, imagine riding your bike that far. Wouldn't that be fun? So, and then we get to more pictures as we get to the turn of the century. The soldiers are looking a lot the same, but now they're using the Krag rifles, smokeless powder. It's a changing world, and they're wearing khaki uniforms in a lot of cases. Their trousers are khaki, some still have blue wool shirts. These guys have a light blue chambray type shirt. And so the Army is acknowledging that, well, we need to adapt our clothing to the environment. And so, well, we get to the end of things, and you might as well, hang out with a friend or hang out with another friend and a bottle of beer. And so thusly finally ends the story. So I want to thank you guys for bearing with me.
What is your take on the rifle that's been found in the national park? Was that in Utah recently?
Nevada.
Yeah.
Oh, was that the one that, what was the story on that?
It was leaning against a tree.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah, that had been dropped there, what, like, about maybe 100 years ago? or-
Leaning up against the tree.
Oh, that's right, and it basically blended in with that. You know, that's it's pretty amazing. You just, you know, I have to say, I actually did find one old musket myself when I was on archaeological survey out in, Superstition Gateway area. There's the golf course out there before you get to Peralta Trailhead area. And we were walking along on this survey, and I looked down, and there's this, you know, kind of rusty pipe-looking thing. Well, it was an old muzzleloader. It was a remnant of an old muzzleloader. It was probably a trade musket of some sort. Who knows when it was dropped? But you know, certainly the one that they found in that park, a lot more spectacular than this other one. But every now and then you bump into that stuff where somebody drops something for who knows, dropped something, put it down. For some reason or trauma, they left something behind. So it's always amazing to hear stories about things like that.
But it looks so well preserved.
You know, with the climate out here, you know, the dry air, and the kind of climate we have, you know, again, if that same rifle had been leaning against a tree, you know, in Louisiana or something like that, you'd probably never find it. You know, but that's right. You know, it's well preserved, and I think it didn't have the wood on it, the stock and all that stuff was on it. Yeah, and that's you know, pretty amazing and exceptional to see that kind of thing. But it's certainly, it always brings up a whole lot of stories and questions about who may have left it there, and they may never find out. But love those historical mysteries.
We're directly north of Castle Hot Springs.
Okay.
Way back in there, there's an area called Milk Ranch. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Milk Ranch, no.
But it's sort of in the middle of that area. I mean, it's so far out of reach of everything and anybody. And then they had along the creek there, somebody had a cabin. Well, they actually rented it home. I mean, it was somebody's home at one time. But I just wondered. I was up there back in the 60s.
Oh, okay.
I haven't been there since.
Oh, okay.
So then I didn't really realize I should start digging things.
You know, there's so many old military posts around here that because they disappeared so long ago,